everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name's Amna, and today we'll be covering basic A/B testing principles. So let's hop right into it. Cool. So let's start off by talking a little bit about my background. So I've been in product management for approximately 5 years, and I started off my product career working on a SaaS marketing platform. And currently, I'm a product manager here at Hulu and have been here for the past 2 years. And in my current role, I work on user experiences that drive subscriber growth across web and OTT. In terms of my responsibilities, I'm responsible for launching new features and leading our growth experimentation program, which is what I'm here to talk to you all about today. So digging into my tenets as a product manager, first and foremost, I always put the user first. With every requirement I write, every user story, every decision I make, it's always with the user at the forefront. And second, my goal is to always build solutions that will scale and make the next feature easier and faster to build. And lastly is to work as a team. It takes various teams and a full team effort to truly launch the best products. So it's always my goal to be as inclusive as possible. Cool. So let's cover our agenda for today. So first, we'll be talking about experimentation lifecycle. The next is the types of experiments. Third is experiments and features. And lastly, we will be discussing top A/B testing challenges. So like I said, we're going to be starting off with experimentation lifecycle. So let's dive in with ideation. So this is the initial step to any experimentation process and starts off with identifying problems or general areas of opportunities based off of user research, user feedback, or business need. And once that opportunity has been identified, a hypothesis must be drafted. The hypothesis is a bold statement that clearly states, what you want to test and what level of impact you think the test will have. And these ideas can come from virtually anywhere within the organization, even out of the organization, from customer service to engineering to the user itself, which is probably the best source. And in my experience, it's best to collect ideas from all portions of the organizations to ensure that you have a very diverse set of testing ideas. So they're not based off of just a single isolated group's thoughts and ideas. And next is prioritization. So once a viable hypothesis has been drafted, the idea must be prioritized against all of your other experiments. Obviously, ideally, you should have a already healthy backlog of experiments to prioritize against. So prioritization is most often based off of a variety of different factors, but the main ones are usually business value, level of effort, and confidence. And there's various prioritization models you could use. However, the most popular ones are known as ICE and PI. The letters in ICE stand for importance, confidence, and ease. And the letters in PI stand for potential, importance, and ease. Theoretically, you'd assign a point score for each one and prioritize accordingly. So next is requirements and designs. So this is the portion of the life cycle where it starts to operate more like a normal project, like any feature work you would usually be writing requirements for. So you'd define the requirements as the product manager, and then those requirements would be executed by design. The requirements should include all the usual suspects like user stories, flows, and acceptance criteria, and obviously detailed requirements. But most important is clearly defining the success metrics. So success metrics, or otherwise known as KPIs, are critical to any experiment because it's what really helps you determine whether the experiment won or lost. Fourth is dev and QA. So at this stage, engineering builds the treatment, tests it to make it production ready, and then you launch the experiment, and then you get to go to the next step, which is the fun part, which is launch the experiment and see it out in the wild and see users interact with it, which is always a really fun experience. Sixth is analysis and learning. So once statistical significance is reached, the experiment just stopped. And from here on out, the results are evaluated to determine whether the control one or the treatment one or treatments, and whether your hypothesis was valid. This is also where you start to evaluate the actual user behavior and establish what you've learned about your users. Because as much as qualitative or quantitative information is valuable, qualitative is also incredibly valuable, and you can kind of infer the qualitative from the quantitative and create general understanding of your user base and apply it across the board, which is a great segue to my last step here, which is next steps. So this is obviously where you establish your next steps, including matching back the learnings back to the product and determining whether the treatment will be rolled out to production and what steps need to take place in order to make it quote unquote production ready. And this is especially important since some, but obviously not all, treatments are hard-coded in order to limit tech's investment in a treatment that hasn't been thoroughly vetted. So there's definitely planning and coordination and collaboration with your engineering team. So next, we will be discussing the different types of experiments. So a roadmap is obviously a must-have for any product team and org, and experimentation is no different. So it's essential to have a roadmap of experiments going into every new year or quarter or month or however you organize it. So there's definitely a few different ways to go about it, but a roadmap is definitely, in my opinion, the best structure to do that. And there's one structure that I'm personally fond of, and I find it to be incredibly beneficial when you're attempting to balance various goals like obtaining user findings, limiting the potential negative impact of a new feature, and maintaining tech investment at the same time. So using the structure will help you organize your ideas, your roadmap, and general timeline. And in my experience, a roadmap is imperative if you have one single Scrum team building out experiments and your feature work. So it's really important for the engineering team to have a very holistic view of the type of work that they're going to be working on outside of their feature work priorities. So let's discuss the actual structure here. So you'll notice we have two categories split up into short-term and long-term experiments, so left to right. And these short-term experiments include the discovery and validation experiments. And these are meant for exploratory and discovery purposes. Specifically, discovery tests are usually proof of concepts, also known as POCs. And these are generally lower level effort experiments, and they're essentially meant to help the business and product collect data around user preferences and overall appetite around a new feature or experience. It's important to note that these tests are not usually production ready or long-term members of an experience. And obviously, like, there may be times where you might want to just roll it out to production based off of business needs. So it's definitely specific to your current business situation, but generally that's kind of like the rule of thumb. So oftentimes these may be partial features or non-functional if the feature is not backed up by any significant research or data. So tech and product may be more reluctant to invest any significant effort into it. And again, significant effort is very relative. So like significant to me may be very different than what significant is to another product manager. It's also based off of your team's velocity and other priorities that you guys may have. So this micro strategy is also known as painted door. So the non-functional feature, it's known as painted door. So if we dive into a specific example, let's say I'm the product manager for Instagram and I want to introduce more animated effects to the direct messaging feature. But tech has informed me that even my MVP experiment requirements would require extensive replumbing and would take almost 2 whole sprints to build. In this case, I decrease the LOE and opt for the painted door method. My requirements would slim down and we'd implement a partially functioning button where the user would receive an error message after clicking on the CTA instead of receiving a collection of animations, which is what the original requirements had asked for. So this would allow us to test the overall engagement, aka the number of clicks, which would help us understand if user appetite was high enough for us to invest in this feature. So next, we're going to talk about validation experiments. So these tests are usually high-level LOE, and these are often features we know we want to release, but we're also aware that this feature will have a potentially high impact on the overall product. And therefore, we'd want to run an experiment to understand its quantitative impact to the business in order to limit any negative impact. So following the results, we'd make a go, no-go decision. And if the results showed that most of our primary KPIs were negatively impacted, then we'd go back to the drawing board, draft a new experience, and obviously one that would help lift those KPIs. It's also important to note that these tests are production ready and should be ready to be rolled out to prod after identifying a winner, which is why they're usually higher level LOE. So for this type of test, in essence, experimentation will be imperative because it's a feature that needs to be in production at some point, but it's just a matter of finding an experience that will produce the best results and or not impact our existing KPIs. So we're looking for, at the very least, flat, statistically significant results. So let's move on to long-term experiments. So these experiments include the evaluation and optimization tests. So evaluation experiments are usually features that have been vetted during the validation process, and we'd still like to test it out another part of the product prior to rolling out the feature all across the board. So let's dig into a specific example. So let's say we tested a complete redesign of Instagram's homepage feed on our Apple devices, and it performed really well, and we rolled it out to Apple. But there's a significant push from the business to roll it out to all of our other devices so we get the same goodness all across the different cohorts of users. So theoretically, we'd want to test the same experience on our Android devices to ensure the results are the exact same and that cohort of users isn't behaving in a different manner than the Apple users did. So once we're comfortable with the outcome, we'd also roll the winner out to production to these Android devices. And lastly is optimization. So these are small to mid-size iterative experiments that work to enhance and button up an existing experience. Examples include CTA changes or CTA copy changes, modifications to imagery, etc. Usually these help meet our stretch KPI goals. And from a consumer standpoint, these might not even be changes that you notice. That's how small they can be. So let's move on to discussing experiments and features. So usually working on large feature work, you'll get this question all the time, primarily from the business team and or various other portions of the business. And they usually ask, well, why do we want to test into a feature that we know we want to roll out to production anyway? We know the users want it. We know it's beneficial to the business in theory. Why wouldn't we just roll it out and have these extra steps in between that take us longer to get to 100% of our user base? And there's actually quite a few reasons why experimentation on features is incredibly valuable. And we're going to go ahead and discuss them right now. So most often, new features reshape the entire product in an incredibly significant way. And obviously, defining the product solution based off of historical data and qualitative research is imperative, but testing the solution is what will make it most successful. And here are some of the top reasons we should be testing large features. So first off, and my personal favorite, and I think one of the most important ones, is building for scale. So testing into a feature will avoid you investing tech resources into an unproven solution and also help the engineering team in making scalable architectural choices instead of making long-term implementation decisions that will require modification to a feature and more viable experience. Your developers will love you for that. Second is obtaining learnings. So you're able to gain learnings about how users are reacting to the new feature through quantitative data, and you're able to feed these learnings into future optimizations to produce the best possible user experience and into other portions of the product. So that's always a win. So it's kind of like a 2-in-1. Third is producing higher ROI. So the business team would love this one. So once a winner is found, you can determine the financial and business impact of the product and design solution. So understanding the quantitative and true business impact has several benefits, including level setting expectations to the business. So, let's say you launched a new feature and business had an expectation that it was going to produce X dollars and, various other benefits to the business. And once we ran the feature as an experiment, you actually determined that, hey, like it's not as impactful as we would have imagined. So it also helps the business to, lay out the groundwork so that they can also accommodate that, I guess, disappointment or like the realistic view of whatever that feature is. And B is limiting the level of negative business impact. So meaning if we can find the product solution is harming the business, then we can find a better solution and avoid long-term hits to the business. So if we rolled out something to production without testing it and it impacted various other top-line business KPIs, then obviously that's a problem and we'd have to roll it back. So testing into it is always the best solution to avoid, a fire drill like that. And C is understanding the scale of product changes that need to take place in order to meet or surpass certain business goals. So next, we're going to talk about top challenges of A/B testing. Cool. So let's start off with the first challenge, which is probably the most common, which is data pollution. So the goal of any new experience is to evaluate how users react to it in the most controlled setting, meaning we should be able to understand how this experience will perform on a very neutral, quote unquote, normal day. So running an experiment during moments of seasonality may potentially jeopardize the integrity of your data. And this is because users may be more motivated during this time and various elements may deter them on this day than they would on a normal day, where they're not as motivated. And this isn't something we should necessarily always 100% of the time avoid, but it's definitely something to be mindful of and incorporate into your data evaluations if you are going to run it during a time of seasonality. Like if you're an e-commerce platform and you're running, a test on Black Friday and you have some really great sales, obviously that's something to keep in mind. Your results may be a little inflated due to the high demand. So keeping that in mind, here are some top ways to avoid data pollution. First is monitor your competitors. So it's important to conduct research to identify major events like competitive offers and promos and changes in the market that may influence user behavior. So for example, for Hulu, I'm mindful to usually run an experiment that collides with major releases like the season premiere of The Handmaid's Tale, because the results may be inflated due to an increased level of demand and traffic and engagement for that specific series premiere or season premiere. Number 2 is to limit the length of the experiment. So while it's important to obtain statistical significance, there's always such a thing as running a test for too long. So the longer you test a treatment, the more you increase your chances of external factors impacting your experiment. Obviously, the length of your experiment depends on your population size and enrollment, but limiting the runtime to less than 4 weeks is usually a good rule of thumb. But again, your site may be running into like specific, traffic issues on certain days. So that's also something you could like navigate and work around. Number 3 is monitoring market trends. So monitoring general market trends will help you ensure you're limiting any external interruptions. So these trends may include events like events that occur outside your organization and also outside of your control, which sucks, but they still have an impact on your product. So a few examples, and this is probably the biggest one that I think all of us have dealt with, is the COVID-19 pandemic, which increased overall digital engagement, for a very, very, very long time. And I know specifically for us, there was even an experiment we ran at the height of our traffic when COVID had just happened in April 2020, and more users were looking to sign up for Hulu. And so we ran an experiment during that time and saw, incredible increases. But we ended up running it again later and found that those numbers were inflated because our traffic was at such an incredible high. So that's also something that impacted us from a market trend perspective. And another, interruption includes security breaches with competitors that may impact user sentiment and trust with your product, because users sometimes may loop it all together. So, a lot of times with streaming services, especially, users loop all of them pretty much together and call it the streaming wars. So it's like if one had a security breach, then we're all probably going to be lumped in together, and users may have, the same sentiment across the board. So second, in terms of challenges, is testing various variables on a single treatment. So the reason you want to be careful about testing too many variables too often is because you won't find out what change did and didn't improve your conversions. So for example, let's say I wanted to modify the header, CTA copy, and imagery altogether on my landing page, and the results came out mixed. So let's say some improvements were made to our KPIs, there were some decreases. In this case, I wouldn't want to roll out the treatment to production given the decreases, but I also wouldn't know what to test next because I don't know what the winning element is. I don't know if it's the CTA copy or the imagery or the header, or if it's all of them put together. I could definitely roll out the entire winner and just say, well, it doesn't really matter, it won, which is true. But then also from a user learning perspective, you're kind of handcuffed because it's like you're always going to have to loop all those three changes together because you don't know what the isolated winner is. And all of them may have contributed to the win. They all may work together in harmony to produce an increase. But there's always one that does a little bit of a better job, and you just won't have that visibility, which is unfortunate. And last is strategists avoiding iterative testing. So it's incredibly common for most strategists to give up after the first iteration of an experiment and move on to a brand new hypothesis. However, this is really problematic since most tests fail on the first try. I think there's maybe been one experiment I launched where it did really well on the first try, and I don't think there's that many I can think of. It's usually like the second or the third that really bring everything home and increase all of the KPIs that we wanted to increase. So the key is to run a test, analyze the data, build your user learnings, and learn from it, and run the test again. And then from there, you should modify and tweak your existing hypothesis and run the experiment again, like I said. And I feel like there's a misconception that a winner must be found on the first try because you've invested time and resources. And that's not wrong. We should be allocating resources and time wisely. As you can see, I mentioned limiting LOE and, having the structure to your experiments. But experimentation is meant to be trial and error. And it's not just important to find a winner. It's also really an excellent way of uncovering user habits in the wild. And, user interviews are great, but you're not getting a full unedited view of how the user truly feels when they're put in a real life user journey with their own money, with their own time. So that's why it's incredibly important to iteratively test and always be learning from the test that came before and applying it to the next. And that concludes our presentation for today. Thank you so much for joining. I hope I provided you with some valuable insights and you learned something today. Thanks and have a great day.